back once again for our final session. In a way, this was sort of planned as the bird's eye picture, aerial view of some of the issues involved in the kinds of partnerships that have been talked about. Rather than any one specific substantive area, as we did throughout the day, this is really focusing more on the issue of partnerships. So the notion of lessons and challenges. And I'm not going to go through the lineup. It's very interesting, and I'm going to get right to it and turn it over to Professor Ed Glaeser, who many of you know, probably most recently as the author of The Triumph of the City. He's an economist here at Harvard. He also is director of the Rappaport Center for Greater Boston and also the Taubman Center. And it's a delight to have Ed moderate the session. So Ed, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Rob. I have been extremely honored to serve as director of the Rappaport Institute for the past 7.5 years. And of course, the mission of the Institute is to connect Harvard with Greater Boston. And because of that, I can't tell you how grateful I am both to the city of Boston and to Radcliffe for making this event happen. This is really, in some sense, a dream come true. And I'm also enormously grateful to everyone who took time out from their busy days to actually be here today. It's sort of a deep paradox, or at least it might seem like a deep paradox, that we live in an age in which distance is dead, in which we can all, locate in whatever woodsy spot appeals to our love of nature, and we could just dial it in. And yet, so many cities throughout the world, like Boston, are thriving, are succeeding in a way that seemed impossible in the 1970s. I believe the reason for this is that what globalization and new technologies have done is that they've increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the returns to new ideas and innovations. And cities are, at their best, machines for making us smarter by connecting us to other smart people, by giving us a range of experiences, by enabling us to learn from a great agglomeration of talent that's around us. Now, in that way, cities are really almost exactly the same thing as universities, which are also places where we come together to learn from the people around us. And given the congruence of both aims and methods, you would think that cities and universities would get along splendidly with each other. After all, cities have a lot to gain from their universities. The work of Enrico Moretti finds that having a land-grant college in your city prior to 1940 has played an enormously important role in economic success over the last 20 or 30 years. And certainly, universities have a lot to gain from having successful cities around them. So you might think they would always get along together splendidly. Well, they don't. And this panel is talking about some of the lessons and challenges about city-university relations. And we really have a spectacular panel drawn from throughout the United States. I'm just going to briefly introduce them. Their full bios are, of course, in the package. Our first speaker is Hank Weber, who is currently the Executive Vice Chancellor for Administration at Washington University in St. Louis. But I think the most salient fact is that he's overseen 21 years, he's played a major role for 21 years in Chicago's efforts to connect with and improve its neighborhood. I was a graduate student in Chicago in the late 80s and early 90s. And I can just say from my own times going back to Hyde Park, going back to that neighborhood, how spectacular their efforts have been. It really has been an extraordinary undertaking, and they really deserve an enormous amount of credit. So we're grateful for Hank to be here and to tell us about his reflections about that. After that, we have Jon-Fen To, who's the Albert M. Greenfield Professor of Human Relations at Penn. And Penn is also something of a model, and I'm going to tell you something that you must promise me never to repeat, because it's really very, very secret, which is why I'm telling you this here, which is that some time ago, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I was sent down by the president of Harvard then on a fact-finding mission to Penn to learn how good city-university relations were actually handled. And I actually went down and spent a day trying to learn from Penn, but you must promise not to tell anyone that Harvard tried to learn from Penn in this manner. And then our third speaker is Margaret Weir, who is a very distinguished political scientist. She's at Berkeley, and she is currently the director, let me get the word right, of the MacArthur Foundation funded research network on building resilient regions. And we're, of course, delighted to have her here. And finally, we have Mitch Weiss, who is Mayor Menino's chief of staff. He's been a great friend to Harvard, a great friend to the Institute, a great friend to me personally. He gave me better comments on my book than any academic friend that I had. But one thing to know about Mitch is that Mitch is a graduate both of Harvard College in economics, and he was a Baker Scholar at Harvard Business School, where he got his MBA, which is a high honor indeed. And if he were a normal person, he would have made $37 million last year running a hedge fund that specialized in shorting French banks. Okay, but in fact, Mitch is not a normal person, and as witnessed by the fact that he's taken a full day off from the incredibly busy life that he leads to be part of this conference, because he's a person who believes passionately in public service, he believes passionately in government, and he believes passionately in the connection between governments and universities, and we're enormously grateful for that. So with that, Hank, take it away.
Thank you, Ed, for that terrific introduction. That's why I not only bought a copy of your book, but I bought 3 other copies and gave them as holiday presents last year. You're welcome. For the past 20 years, I've spent a large percentage of my working life thinking about and acting to strengthen the relationship between universities, communities, and cities. For the past 11 years, I led the University of Chicago's efforts. For the past 4 years, I've helped to shape Washington University in St. Louis's urban strategy. What I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes, no more, is describe the University of Chicago and Washington University's experience, and then offer a set of propositions about the characteristics of successful university-city partnerships. Let me start with the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has perhaps the longest history of intense attention to urban issues of any major American research university. There are 3 reasons. First is a deep connection between the university and the surrounding neighborhood. Very unusually for an urban university, the majority of the faculty at the University of Chicago, in a city of 9 million people, region, live in the immediate neighborhood. The neighborhood is the intellectual community of the university. Second is a history of deep intellectual engagement with the city of Chicago and applied problems. 2 of the original 4 units of the University of Chicago were the School of General Studies, which educated the public, and the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, founded by John Dewey as a living example of how to revolutionize American education. In the 1930s, the Chicago School of Sociology established the modern field of urban sociology by using the city as its laboratory. And in the early 1980s, William Julius Wilson, predominantly based on research in a set of neighborhoods within a few miles of the campus of the University of Chicago, defined the problem of urban distress for a generation of scholars and policymakers, and set the intellectual basis for the growth of mixed-income housing across the U.S. Third is a set of institutional needs. In the early 1950s, the city of Chicago entered a period of very sharp decline. There were rapid demographic change in the neighborhoods around the University of Chicago and throughout much of the city, in fact. 800,000 people left Chicago between 1950 and 1990. And a vicious crime problem emerged. The university was forced to ask the question, can we continue as a world-class university if we are located in a sea of urban blight? The response was urban renewal. In the late 1950s, the University of Chicago partnered with the city of Chicago to become the first urban renewal neighborhood in the country. Together, they undertook a dramatic program to preserve a middle-class, mixed-race community in Hyde Park. The strategy involved the physical reshaping of the neighborhood, removing vibrant but run-down and crime-ridden commercial and residential properties, reducing neighborhood density, and building townhouses, and allowing for university and other institutional expansion. In addition, there was a strong focus on neighborhood safety. By most standards, urban renewal in Hyde Park was successful, far more successful than urban renewal in most places in America. The neighborhood has maintained itself over the past 50 years as a truly integrated, vibrant urban neighborhood. And the university has done wonderfully. On the other hand, the displacement of a considerable number of minority residents during urban renewal contributed to great estrangement between the university and its South Side neighbors. Steve Rodenbush noted earlier today. And the physical changes in the neighborhood left Hyde Park attractive, but a little boring. Very careful readers of Jane Jacobs will know that she hated urban renewal in Hyde Park, arguing that it imposed a suburban plan on an urban neighborhood. She was not, in my opinion, all wrong. By the time I came to manage the University of Chicago's community strategy in the mid-1990s, the world and the neighborhood had seen major changes. The university had won the battle for stability, but now wanted to make the neighborhood more vibrant. Chicago had completed its transition from a manufacturing and agricultural processing city to the gleaming service city on the lake we now know of. Diversity was an asset. And it was finally possible to imagine Hyde Park not as an island of relative prosperity in a sea of poverty, but as a part of a newly revitalized south side of Chicago, of the city of Chicago, connected to the Loop and the north side. The strategy that came out of it, a strategy that was built with the support of partners being community groups, foundations, and the city of Chicago, included improving public education. This is the neighborhood part of the 4 charter schools operated around the university. Making all mid-South Side neighborhoods safe by extending the University of Chicago police, improving community amenities, particularly parks and arts options, through joint programs with the city and cultural institutions, supporting real estate development and affordable housing, and encouraging business growth, private sector business growth on the south side of Chicago. Not all of these strategies were academic in content, but whenever possible, the university engaged faculty and tried to build those academic programs that had a community as well as a scholarly focus. Most notable of those are the Urban Education Initiative, which Steve Rodenbush talked about a little bit earlier, and its counterpart in the medical area called the Urban Health Initiative. While there's a lot left to do, by any standards, it's a better place now than it was before these initiatives. In 2007, I moved to Washington University in St. Louis. It's a different context with different challenges. Most of the neighborhoods surrounding the university and its medical school, they are not contiguous, are strong, and some of them are terrific. As a city, however, St. Louis is challenged. St. Louis is the epitome of an older industrial city, albeit an older industrial city with a great baseball team who will win the World Series next week. That will not happen, Red Sox fans. We're not growing, and we haven't grown for a long time. And it is not good for a city or for a university located in a city to be in a region that isn't growing. To the extent that there's been great economic prosperity in the region, much of it involves the university itself as an institution. We have 13,000 employees. We're the second or third, depending on how you count, largest private employer in the region. And we've added 3,000 jobs in the last decade. We have a $5 billion impact on the local economy. Our strategy, which is evolving, is to contribute to regional economic growth through partnership with others and to public discussion of key issues, to be a locus of discussion, of dialogue around key issues. And also to apply our academic strengths to regional issues, to public health, to public education, and to entrepreneurship and innovation. And our strategy right now is to build partnerships in those 3 areas. So that's a little background. So what have I learned in 20 years? And I'm going to reduce it to 10 propositions in 5 minutes. First, sustainable partnerships are based on mutual self-interest and have clear rules of engagement. Cities need services for vulnerable populations and smart public policy. Academic institutions need to educate their students and produce research. This is the reality. And the challenge is not to change either party, to say you should be different than you are. I believe that's a fool's errand. The challenge is to build a fit between those needs. Furthermore, academic research on urban issues of interest to cities usually involves access to public data, such as school records, crime statistics, public health records. It is critical to providers of the data and the academics doing research work out the inevitable issues of exactly what will be done with the data, how it will be released, whether the public agency will have the ability to comment on results prior to publication, etc. To fail to work these issues out in advance is to invite conflict. Second, many of the strongest partnerships between universities and cities are based on academic programs that combine service with research and human capital development. The model for such partnerships is the work of many academic medical centers with teaching programs. The Urban Education Initiative, as referenced earlier, is another example in another policy area. But let's be clear. It is good when a medical school sponsors a free Saturday clinic where medical students and faculty volunteer their time serving a poor population. It is far better when a medical school offers a primary care medicine program that combines partnerships with local community health centers with training resident physicians to serve as future providers in such clinics and builds a research program in community health. The closer university programs are to teaching and research, the more sustainable they are. 3, academic institutions can, in most, if not all cases, only be helpful in solving public problems in areas of pre-existing academic strength. As broad as impressive as great universities are, they do not have strength in all areas. It would be very good for St. Louis, for example, if Washington University had a strong regional economics program. We don't, and hence need to contribute in other ways to the challenges of our region. 4th, academic analysis of key public initiatives is risky for all. The hallmark of academic research is the independence of the investigator. This means the investigator may well find out that the most cherished program of the city government, or even the university itself, may have little impact on the problem they would like to solve. Research is not consulting. By its nature, it often exposes flaws. And in my experience is that not every organization is as willing to hear bad news as it seems like the Boston Police Department seem to this morning. 5, universities and their civic partners may well value the components of their partnership differently. Issues of limited interest to the academy, such as accurate reviews of trends over time, are often of great interest to public agencies. The Consortium on Chicago Research, for example, has produced groundbreaking results that have national implications using very advanced analytics. Many of my friends in the Chicago public schools, who are high school principals, find the most valuable thing they do every year is their annual report of what dropout rates are. It's done by a junior analyst who was a college graduate 2 years ago. What they want to know is how they're doing it, slowing down dropouts. 6, university-city partnerships have high transactions costs and require staffs with skills at bridge building. It is not obvious for university folks how city folks think and work, and it's not obvious on the other side. And you need bridge builders to do that. 7, neighborhood change, which is a lot of what city-university partnerships are about, but not the focus of this conference, is both difficult to achieve and inevitably conflictual. Neighborhoods change slowly over long periods of time. And even at best, those changes don't benefit all. Universities that seek neighborhood change should expect conflict. 8, contributing to regional economic growth is both expected of universities in much of the country and difficult to achieve. Universities are not economic growth machines. They select faculty because of their contributions to knowledge and teaching ability, not because faculty are marvels at company creation. At the same time, the decline of other industries in many cities, particularly Rust Belt cities, along with the growth of university budgets and the examples of Route 128 in Silicon Valley, inevitably turn public attention to universities as tools for economic growth. We need to accept that. 9, there is great value in universities developing operating programs that test new ideas. This is Steve Rodenbush's point earlier today. The best bridge between theory and practice is often the development of real models that are tested on the ground. Such programs force academics to deal with real-world implementation issues, and if successful, provide proof on the ground of success. Charter schools, community health clinics, and early childhood education centers are examples of modern program areas. Praxis is a good thing. And 10th and last, universities can and should serve as forums for regional discussion of key issues. Universities are an appropriate forum for thoughtful, polite discussion, analysis, and reflection on the most important challenges facing regions. They are places where people within and outside the academy can gather for serious work, in public, in private, and in small and large groups. Few of us along the country have maximized our value in this way. Thank you.
Okay, good, we're live. I think as we're coming to the end of this rich, full, cup overflowing, need a cot very soon period of time, I was thinking about 3 words that actually match my first slide. 3 words that I heard over and over again in many different ways. The first was equity. I sort of see equity as what's compelling us here as we're actually our common purpose for coming together. We're interested and concerned about the inequities and the hardships that are facing many. The other is relevancy. Here we're talking here about being strategic, being timely, being real. But the third one I heard was capacity. And I think this is the one that's the kicker. It's capacity. How do we do it? How do we create infrastructure? So I wanted to just reflect a little bit with you, is that as we basically are faced with what seems to be insurmountable problems and challenges, we are compelled to do something and to address these inequities. And so we actually really compel our leaders to do something. Our leaders legislate, appropriate, spend, and do. We actually do a lot, and we spend a lot. And the problem is not that we are not doing, it's that we are not doing wisely enough to produce measurable and sustainable positive outcomes that produce real hope. Our major scholars in the field of public administration, Don Kettle is one of my favorites. He really diagnoses the problem in 3 ways. He basically talks about our systems as hierarchical, top-down decision-making. He talks about what we've talked about in our meetings here about these departmental silos, how we actually have focused on particular pieces of serving the individual, or we focus on specific problems that departments are resolved around. And also, the modus operandi relates to sustaining the funding built into the regulations and appropriation structure. So we end up collecting data for fiscal responsibility purposes. No context for collaboration, no data connections across service programs for the whole person, no theory of change about how programs relate to individual outcomes. In essence, no collective civic action guided by what I call actionable intelligence. I want to share with you today a little bit about a model that my colleagues and I at Penn, Dennis Culhane in particular, have been developing. And actually, we were pulled into service by then Mayor Rendell of Philadelphia a while back. And I wanted to share with you how this approach actually addresses some of these challenges. And it's one approach, but it produces collective civic action guided by actionable intelligence. We start with some of the core components of this. And basically, there are 3 key folks that we have to have positioned in this partnership. Most of the time, we're talking about researchers in relationship to stakeholders and practitioners. But I really feel the key issue for us is to be talking about the partnership with executive leaders. I mean, we've had some executive leaders here, our superintendent and others, really expressing to us some of their pain about the positions they're in and their unique challenges. So the question is, how do we basically recognize the unique challenges of bringing these very different groups together to form a productive we? How do we create a collective efficacy? How do we create two-way arrows? And I'm thinking about the word, we use the word relationship a lot, and I've been married 33 years, and I don't know, Hank, my wife thinks she's trying to change me every day, and I think I've been different every day by my influence with her. Being in a relationship means an intense give and take. It means to be in a context of dynamic tension. The people who have guts stay in the relationship. The people who want to do it their own way walk away from the relationship. So there are these, we talk about them a lot, at each of these parts of the triangle, there are unique tensions that are really, I call it partnering with resistance. You really have to find out the sort of informed dissent, why people don't want what you've got to give. And it's because of their attributions, their belief systems. For example, tensions between practitioners and executive leaders about identifying priorities and allocating resources. They don't la walk down the trail, they fight with each other. With respect to researchers and practitioners, the use of measurements that are inappropriate and culturally insensitive. Researchers that think they have evidence-based practice when they don't even know what the realities are of the people that they're researching. With respect to executive leaders, you really have, and researchers have such a far way to go on this trail, even to come into the party. They're not even any of the rings of the circus. They're not even under the tent most of the time. So the question is, they can provide a lot, but they are not necessarily big on the we set of skills. Matter of fact, I would basically see, at least on our campus, I know the EGO disease is epidemic proportions. I don't know about on your campus. But the question is, what we need is something that creates a common language. You remember the Tower of Babel? When basically communication stopped, everyone went to their tribes. We need a common language to move this forward. We believe that what is an exciting opportunity is the common language of integrated data. That we really believe that what is needed is bringing together information from these different silos about the same clients that actually creates a common language of advancing equity and producing effective change for individuals. So the common language provides the picture of the whole child that comes from information integrated across these information silos. They produce a comprehensive picture of the whole child that begins to motivate us and makes us think. We've heard about violence, we've heard about education, we've heard about health, but guess what? The individual experiences health, education, and violence. So the question of what's behind, why are children behind? Well, we have to understand what's behind being behind, and much of the variance of what's behind being behind isn't in the purview of the educators. It comes from other data sources, other points of information. So the question is, we really say that our goal should be to produce actionable intelligence. I don't use the R word. I'm not talking about research, and I'm not talking about data. I'm talking about intelligence. Intelligence comes when my wife and I look at our checkbook, look at our situation, talk and hammer it out what we're going to do in the face of the evidence. That is, how are we going to, what's important is what information allows us to take a strategic action. Here we want actionable intelligence to create cross-agency collaborations, because integrated data ain't nothing unless it produces integrated services that move the ball for that little child. We also need data, like our colleagues were talking about in terms of Chicago and in all these wonderful examples that we've had, how we have data that actually creates a theory of change to improve quality of services. for us, this means that we come together and formulate for the partnership, for the collaboration, for the triangle, a common purpose. We then have to get the relevant information from the multiple sources that are relevant to that problem and integrate that data to basically start to bring all the different groups, all the data sharing, all the helpers around one table. And that's the goal. That is basically one table using intelligence derived from data to solve a problem. In Philadelphia, we've basically brought together the school district, the city, and the city courts with the university and with local philanthropy. And we basically targeted this executive leadership, identifies the priorities, 3 critical transitions: early school success, homelessness and school mobility, and out-of-school youth. These serve as the priorities for which to create the collaborations, bring the relevant data together, and then have action teams progressively across time collecting information programmatically that informs the work to be done. So I'll just highlight, I'm not going to have time to give you a number of examples, but I'll just highlight a couple. So the notion for closing the gap, information, well, we basically set up a series of projects where we actually took a look at whole populations of children as they were moving into the educational system to identify what's behind being behind, what's accounting for the variance in these publicly monitored data. We then basically took a look at all the programs in the city, the early childhood programs, and looked at their relative effectiveness and begin to develop a theory of change about components for effectiveness. And then how do we then come together and develop programs that improve the quality and actually do randomized control trials on those programs to see that they significantly improve. So we were able to identify the risks and protective factors. More importantly, is as we're identifying the information, the dialogue continues. So we identify what does it mean when we basically find a temporal relationship between families in shelters and predictions of child protective services. So we start to set up a theory of change that can inform prevention. Another program was the out-of-school youth program called Project U-Turn, where we identified early warning indicators for high school dropouts, developed early intervention targets, created typologies of dropouts, and developed programs to target these subpopulations. With homelessness and school mobility, it's basically different models, different data about who's coming into the shelters, different data about where they go, prevention strategies, effectiveness of different housing procedures, McKinney-Vento compliance or not. These research projects are not one-off research projects, but they're basically fostering a dialogue of inquiry that's utilizing this built capacity of this integrated system. Now, the question is, what are the qualities of an integrated system? You don't just put data together. I think many of the states are suffering from this integrating data. They think, you know, you get a big IBM machine and you put the data together and you have a system. Well, no, you won't, because no one will be able to use it. You have to think of 4 major challenges for building a quality system. They're the legal issues, the scientific issues, the ethical issues, and the economic issues. And I'll probably close with that because I have a minute or 2 left. So what you're doing in building and using, because if you don't have and using, building was a waste, right? So it's and using drives building. And the verbs are get, integrate, use, share, and sustain. Obviously, the bottom, we've been talking about relationships, establishing collaborations to get the data, have to deal with these legal issues that we've been talking about, navigating HIPAA and FERPA. Scientific issues, 1 minute, right on cue. Scientific issues relate to the issues of researchers aren't going to use data if data doesn't have quality. So we're talking about what are the quality issues for use of data, and also the science of integration. The ethical issues have to be the issues that create the demonstration of use that drives community discussion and fosters the efficacy, the collective efficacy of the partnership. And then at the top of the pyramid is economic and political issues to ensure sustainability. These are huge, and they relate to basically the whole emphasis for the executive leadership, which is benefit cost, that the leadership has to basically demonstrate that it's effective by basically doing things more economically and more effective. And that's where you're beginning to introduce why the leadership needs actionable intelligence. How not any one of your departments is failing, and no person in your department is failing. Where you're failing is at the nexus between departments, because that's where we're failing our children. And we can talk all we want about education, and then we can talk about like what's happening with respect to what's accounting for the variance of those growth curves. And we can't account for all the variance in those growth curves because there's substantial things behind being behind that we need to grab. And we have many, many competent service workers who are focusing on those tasks. I'll just say that the MacArthur Foundation has been very excited about some of the work that we've been doing and others have been doing, and has actually commissioned Dennis and I to create a network of successful integrated data systems that are producing actionable intelligence across time. So you can go to this, these are the cities and states that are in our network, and our goal is to establish what this professional network does and how to basically disseminate best practice for it. You can, if you are interested in learning more about the network, we can tell you more about it. But we have a lot to learn from each other across cities and across states about how we actually bring executive leadership and stakeholders and practitioners and researchers to the table in actual relationships, not one-off grant projects. Thank you.
So I've learned so much from today, and I also want to thank the organizers of the conference. My talk today is a little bit of a change of pace. It's based on my research, which looks at metropolitan areas and is not specifically focused on city-university partnerships. But the case that I want to make is that we need to expand our focus beyond the city to the region. The reason is that many of the key issues for metro areas go beyond the city. And the cities are really where these university partnerships are the strongest. But the combination of employment decentralization, the spread of metro areas out to encompass older, declining industrial cities, the increase in poverty outside the central cities. The latest data shows that there is, in fact, numbers of poverty are higher in suburbs than they are in cities, although the rate of poverty is higher in cities. The growing number of immigrants who simply bypass cities and go directly to suburbs, poor and not poor immigrants. All of these things suggest that to understand the city, we need to understand the region, and to understand many of the things that made us want to understand cities, we need to look at those problems in a very different context now, which is the region. And I'll show you very quickly some, there's that slide. I'll show you very quickly some slides of the Atlanta area that just demonstrate some of the changes. So this is, I don't know how the color, yeah. So this is Atlanta, the Atlanta area in 1990, the percent foreign-born. Atlanta is not traditionally a city of immigration. In 1990, it did not have very many immigrants. The highest, the darkest green there is 23%. Look at Atlanta in 2007. Very significant concentrations of immigration in the northwestern part of the city, not in the city of Atlanta, notably, and also a little bit in the southern part of the city there in Clayton County. Let me show you another map. This one is of poverty. in the Atlanta metro area. Poverty was historically focused in the central city and in those rural poverty in those outer counties. This is 1990, and it's the 150% poverty line. Flash forward to 2000. Yes, no. Yes, flash forward to 2007. And what you see is poverty. There it is, 1990. Flash forward to 2007. Poverty is fanning out through the metro area. It's going up into the northwestern suburbs, the southern suburbs of Atlanta, although it remains more concentrated in the city of Atlanta. Poverty has become a more complex problem in terms of the context in which it is found. And the final map I'll show you is the people who have a bachelor's degree or higher. In 1990, they're located in these wealthier northern part of Atlanta suburbs. And then when you flash forward, it's an even more exaggerated picture. What's happening to the Atlanta area is happening to other places. The region is stretching out, and people with advantages are concentrating in one part of the area, and people with fewer advantages are concentrating in the other part of the area. And Atlanta has a kind of a north-south axis, with the north is where job creation is happening. That's where people who are more highly educated, et cetera, and the south is becoming further away from opportunity with people with fewer resources. So what these maps, I'll leave that map up, what these maps suggest is that we have many familiar issues that we've studied for a long time, but now they're in a very different context. And that context is one, somebody earlier talked about capacity, that context is one where there are very few capacities for public administration. There are often very few nonprofit organizations and very little history or experience in dealing with this set of issues. So in the few minutes of my presentation, what I would like to do is just to give you a sense of what some of the university collaborations have been in these kinds of suburban areas and in the regional context. And these have not been the focus of my study, but in the context of running across and doing interviews in suburban areas to try to understand how they build capacity, these are some of the engagements of university that I thought were would be interesting and relevant here. So one of them is simply the university engaging as the regional data center. And I know Boston has the kind of the Boston Indicators project, but it may be useful for universities to connect with and build regional data sets that are open and available to researchers and accessible to cities and suburbs in the region. The one that this is a map of foreclosures in the Cleveland area. It's a big data set that has been run out of Case Western Reserve since 1988. It includes a wide variety of economic and demographic data, social program data, administrative data. They're constantly kind of adding new data sets to it. So it serves as a resource for nonprofit organizations. What has made it possible to be there since 1988 is the strong engagement of Cleveland's philanthropic community. They have supported it throughout this time period. And the issue of funding is one that has come up before in this conference. One of the collaborators in my project is someone who ran a regional institute in the Buffalo area for 10 years with out of the University of Buffalo. And when I asked her about, well, tell me about your collaboration and your data gathering there, and she said, we didn't have sufficient funding. And as a result of that, it was hard to build consistent relationships in the region. We were always chasing the next grant. Our reward inside the academy was when we got the next grant, and they couldn't build relationships because they had to chase grants. And the damage that was done is that they would collaborate with an entity in the region, and they would get the expectations up for that collaborator, and then they would walk away because the grant was over. So the sustained support for a resource that will be there dependably over time seems to be one critical feature of university collaborations. The other thing, the second, in addition to data gathering, is helping to build new local nonprofit capacities. The majority of suburban governments have little experience and few resources for addressing the needs of low-income residents, for addressing the needs of immigrants. They're often small governments. And so one of the collaborations that I did some interviews with was something called the DuPage Human Resources, DuPage Federation on Human Resources Reform. Well, these Chicago researchers here, DuPage County is a wealthy county that's to the west of Chicago, but it is a county that now has a significant refugee population. Poverty has doubled there. It still has a low poverty rate, but this is one of the, an agency that was created there within the last 10 years, and what it does, it serves as, in a sense, research and development for human services. It provides the information so that the human services agencies in the county can have data to do their grant writing. These agencies don't have a lot of experience, they don't have a lot of capacity, and so rather than kind of competing with them, it serves as a kind of a glue and resource, information resource. And this is one of their most, when I talk to them, this is one of their most requested fact sheets, is who are the new neighbors? This place has changed. What does this have to do with city and university collaborations? This federation was actually created by Northern Illinois University. The people that work there are employees of Northern Illinois University. That university had a strength in public administration, and they decided to put that to the test in creating this agency. The question, and I think the challenge here in these suburban areas, is being perceived as an interloper by the organizations that do exist. So I think the question in these places is usually, what's the entry point? And I was very interested to see in the earlier presentation that in Gwinnett County, which is one of the counties that has become, in Atlanta, that has become majority minority. It's an exurban county, classic white flight county in Atlanta, that the schools are the entry point, because the schools are the place that sees the change, that sees the need first. And I was interested to see that they were one of the collaborators in their strategic data project, because in fact the county itself is not so receptive. They, have banned taco trucks, et cetera. They're trying to do what they can to make people go away. So, what are the entry points and how do you find them? And the final kind of challenge in suburban areas is a political problem of fragmentation. A lot of suburban areas have multiple small local governments. One area that I've been studying are the southern suburbs of Chicago. 1 million people spread across 53 municipalities. They have a foreclosure problem. They have a homeless problem. The way you get federal money for that is by being able to apply for it. You need a collaboration of some sort. You need to bring that fragmentation together if you're going to be able to pull down those federal dollars. Universities may have a role to play here. No, this is suburban homelessness looks different. People live in hotels. And here's an example that one of my colleagues in this project has worked with, and it's in the St. Louis area, 24 different communities that are, inner ring suburbs, poor communities, and they've tried to pull together as the idea, 24 communities, one vision. They were pulled together by a nonprofit. They also have an advantage that they have a single school district, which helps bring them together. But the university is serving mainly to do research and to support their ability to get this grant. So let me just say, one of the big challenges in these suburban areas is they have incredibly weak governments, and they're often just full of like cronyism, et cetera. And this was Bell, California, which you may have read about in the New York Times, and that's the city manager, the guy in the yellow, I think, who made $800,000 as city manager. It's a huge problem. They're not receptive to outsider, many of these areas, so building relationships and finding that entry point is one of the biggest issues that a university collaboration or any kind of collaboration confronts in these areas. But increasingly with gentrification of cities, finding inroads into these suburban areas, I think, are increasingly important. And maybe I will stop right there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Margaret. Thanks.
So I'm just going to stay put. I guess I'm the last panelist between you and cocktails, and seeing as I just recently came of legal age, our interests are mutual here in me being brief. I wanted to recognize a lot of the mayor's cabinet and his other senior staff for being here today, the police chief, the head of economic development, the chief information officer, the school superintendent. This is either an amazing sign of the commitment they have to these partnerships or like a secret plan by Cambridge to flank us while the mayor's out of town. Like new meaning added to the word triumph for the city, I guess. But I really do thank them for all their commitment and all they do to make these partnerships so strong. I think you've seen so many of them today, and the fruits of those labors either over the lunchtime discussions or you'll see others during the course of the poster presentations. I just want to reiterate a bit of background on Peter Mead went through some of it this morning, just to give you that added context, I think, about Boston's exceptionalism, Boston's excellence, so that you have a sense for where these partnerships are located in and how successful they've been. We do continue to grow. As Peter mentioned, we grew faster than New York, Philadelphia, faster than Atlanta, faster than Chicago, which is shrinking, faster than San Francisco. It's a sign of strength in Boston. We're a majority-minority city, which brings us a long way from our not-so-proud past. We were the fastest-growing metro area next year in terms of our economy. Last year, in terms of our economy, we were one of only 13 cities to have more private sector jobs now than we did 5 years ago. Those are important statistics in this day of joblessness. And we're winning, as Peter also mentioned, we're winning the all-important war for 20 to 34-year-olds, the war for the young workforce. We have more than any other city in the country. We passed Austin, Texas, a hotbed of youth and coolness this summer. Our strategy for the Innovation District on South Boston waterfront is a big part of the success. And there we have the world's best school for entrepreneurship, the world's largest startup competition, the country's biggest private development project, not to mention 80 new businesses, 2,000 new jobs, another 2,000 on the way. It's a booming cluster of innovation and a big part of driving our success. I should say also that Ed's work has shaped our thinking on this for me at least, every week, if I only talk to him, every month. And it's a sign that our relationships between us and the university are still very robust. It's not just Ed's work that has shaped us. Our efforts on new urban mechanics were shaped by Professor at HBS, Michael Tushman, who studies ambidextrous organization, who's never studied the city at all. But we brought his work in. Michael Norton writes on inequality, never met the guy, but the mayor used his statistics yesterday to make a point about economic inequality. Yochai Bankler's work on peer production was very influential to me and the work that I'm doing in city government, and he didn't know it until I told him. So the back and forth is alive and well, but it's leading to a lot of success in Boston. Our innovation strategy, which Nigel helped describe earlier, is truly a national model. Mayor's offices of new urban mechanics are popping up now literally in other cities. And Bill Oates, who's here, Nigel and his colleague Chris Osgood are literally at the forefront of civic innovation across this country. Citizens Connect is being copied here, literally across the river, and in other cities. And our school system, as the superintendent said, is, or she didn't say, but she could have said, is one of the most improved in the world. Our green agenda makes us one of the top 5 in the country. Our healthy eating, anti-obesity agendas are at the forefront. I could go through the list again and again, but I think it's important to note that Boston really has become a hotbed of progress, as evidenced by people who are moving here with their feet, and also by the recognition we get nationally. Our mayor is in his 19th year and has extraordinarily high approval ratings and has a personal commitment to the city which is unmatched. His personal commitment to the city is unmatched. He has actually met more than 300,000 of the 600,000 residents who live in this city. None of none of the success, actually it's a problem when the city keeps growing is to go out and meet more people, but we'll suffer through that. None of this do we accomplish alone, and our university partners have played a large role in that. That's one message I wanted to emphasize again today, that our success, our excellence is in large part because of what we've been doing with the university over time. So we have been the beneficiary of a number of ideas, as I said, on an individual basis and through partnership around violence, around schools, around technology, around public health. We've also been the beneficiary of a lot of talent from the university, and you might be surprised to know that the mayor's chief of staff, myself, the school superintendent's chief of staff, our chief financial officer, our chief service officer, one of the co-chairs of our mayor's office of new urban mechanics, all came to the city by way of a fellowship program, one fellowship program at one school at this university. So there's a constant pipeline of talent from the university into government, which is bringing with them all their ideas. And it's not just the full-time fellows. Our summer fellows have had an enormous impact, have gotten our food truck effort underway, have gotten our urban agriculture effort underway, have gotten an effort to gamify financial literacy underway. These fellows, many of them Rappaport fellows, are making a huge difference here in the city. The pipeline of talent is perhaps the most important way that we get ideas into city government. So the great, great news is that we do not have to, in Boston, imagine a strong relationship between the city and its universities. We have one. We have a great relationship. However, that doesn't let us off the hook for reimagining one. And that's why we've been here today. The mayor often says that status quo is standing still, and universities and cities can neither survive if we don't continue to move forward. So as we reimagine our work together, my point is that we shouldn't focus so much on the challenges between our relationship. We've talked a lot about the obstacles in the way between the city and the universities, but I think we should focus on what the challenges are for cities as a whole. I think we should focus on what is the biggest problem facing cities these days, and that way we'll make sure that whatever work we do together serves the highest common good. So what is that? What is that largest challenge that cities face today? We talk about a lot of things: gun violence, stubborn graduation rates, et cetera, but the biggest thing is unemployment, joblessness, is the results of the economic crisis that came in the financial crisis that precipitated it, and the budget crunch that it left in its wake for us. The biggest problem the cities face by far today is what the economic crisis has wreaked on its residents. There's no question about that. All the problems flow from there. At least many of them do. And so I think if we want to think about how we make our relationship, us and the university, more fruitful, we think about how it is that we address that topic. And I think if we want to think about that, we have to ask ourselves, how does the university address those topics? Is it through partnerships like this, or is it more about how they actually impact ideas in the world about economics, about job creation? And I think it's the latter. And I think if we ask if it's the latter, that is that universities impact big ideas in the world, and we say, okay, at this university, are as many resources being devoted to solving that problem, the problems of the economic crisis, the problem of joblessness, as they should? Is that up to the task? I think that the answer is, an honest assessment is no. That not when we have 9% plus unemployment in the country, 7% plus here. I think that if that's the problem from which all else flows, and we ask ourselves, is the university doing all it can, universities writ large doing all they can to help address that problem, I think the answer is not. And then if we want to look at our relationship, I think we say, well, how can we help solve that problem? How can we help get universities to think about that more and do more work on that? Some of the challenges there have been addressed already. In academia, scholarship is I think suffers from two maybe important trends. One, it's highly, highly quantitative these days, and there's a big focus on solving small problems precisely and rewarding those things with journal publication, not other things. Tackling a question about solving joblessness is actually, even though we have economists who study job creation, is actually not something that universities in some cases study that particularly well. This trend towards very narrow, very technical science has gotten in the way a bit. And related, I think the notion that scholarship really is meant to serve the public good has diminished somewhat. Jim Taubman, who was a Nobel Prize winner for economics, had said that he went into economics because of its potential to help humankind. And I have no doubt that all the PhD students who go into economics these days, or almost all of them, feel the same way when they start. The question is, do they feel the same way 5 years hence? And I think an honest answer, because the pressures of the institutions and things and the incentive systems are no. So I think there's this one trend that I think we have to worry about, and the second trend is an idea in economics and political science and other parts of the social science that government is so subject to corruption and so subject to capture by special interests that we are more of a hindrance than help. That was the dominant theme, not the universal one, but the dominant theme in the years leading up to the crisis, and it still exists today. And So it might seem strange, but I think that the most important thing that a partnership that we could put together between a city and a university would be to address in some way the research orientation that is done on scholarship. Think to yourself for a second, what are the chances over time that all the time and money invested by people in this room, in fellowships, in data sharing, in new partnerships, could stand up to those two trends? One, the sort of specialization and technicalization of academic research, and two, the trend in large parts of economics and political science that government can't do anything well. What's the chance then that scholars are really going to study what they can do well? And worse, what's the chance that graduates of these esteemed universities are going to want to go into government when that's the orientation that they've been addressed with for 4 years or for 7 years or for 10 years if they're doing graduate studies? I think the chance that our work together can stand up to those trends is very little. But I'm actually really optimistic because I think the chance that our partnership could change those trends is very high. And I think that we could do it if we just tweaked a couple of things that we're planning on doing. So let me give a couple of examples. I think there's been some discussion about a database or a data warehouse. And I think data sharing is all well and good, and I think that we should engage further in those aspects. But imagine if along with that website, along with that warehouse, there was a warehouse of questions from policymakers about the most important questions they had. Imagine if that was available to PhD students, and so every single time they said, they went to an advisor and said, what should I do my dissertation on? The advisor said, you know what you should do? You should look at the website where you've got policymakers wondering deep questions about problems they have. And it wouldn't be so much that the PhD student would write a paper that would solve that problem the next day or the next week or the next month or the next 3 years. But think about what impact that might have on that PhD student for the rest of their life, for the 20 or 30 years they spend doing scholarship, what it would mean to orient them towards doing work that was actually driven by public need, and to remind them time and again. I think we could do that. I think that as we build databases of data, we could also build databases of questions, and we could change the life's work of graduate students in the social sciences. So that's one thing I think we could do together. The second thing I'll mention, and then I'll just finish up, is that there's no public entrepreneurship on balance being taught at public policy schools. If you look at public policy schools, a huge thrust of what they teach these days is analysis, is data engineering around efficiency. And that the truth is in government and every place else, we have to be able to learn how to produce something out of nothing. Innovation and entrepreneurship have become basically the cure-all for the private sector, the watchword for the new economy, right? In the social sector, policy schools are racing to teach social entrepreneurship and doing it very well and encouraging folks to get into nonprofits. But where's our coursework on public entrepreneurship? I think that there's been a creeping sense in the social sciences over the last several decades about government can't do. Why don't we teach classes on public entrepreneurship? Why don't we do this? Why don't we combat the idea that government can't do, not with the idea that government can do, but with the actual reality that it can do? And why don't we accomplish that by teaching public entrepreneurship? So 2 ideas I had in listening to folks today and thinking about this, reflecting over the years, are one, we need to make sure that our work is shaping the future work of PhD students. At the Taubman project, which I ran before coming to City Hall, we had a whiteboard, a digital whiteboard of questions. The most important decision a scholar makes, Jim Taubman used to say, are what problems to work on. I think we could help scholars decide what problems to work on. And the second thing I think we could do is teach public entrepreneurship. I've been really gratified to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity. I don't get a lot of time to spend outside of City Hall, and it's a real tribute to our partners at Harvard, at the Rappaport Institute, at Radcliffe, for inviting us here today and for encouraging us to continue to have such a strong partnership. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitch, for those extraordinary words. And I want to just draw on that for 1 second, because I think there was something so important in that. And it really does involve reimagining the city-university connection. Embedded in Mitch's words was the idea that, in fact, for this partnership to work, you need a fair amount of confidence on the part of the city government, right? And that's something that came across actually in all of the speakers. You need actually the city government to have enough trust in itself to let in outsiders, to talk with outsiders. And indeed, this government has a lot to be confident about. I went home to handle some things, and went back to my office to handle a few things during lunch. And of course, I had my invitation to Governing Magazine's Public Officials of the Year, 2 of which, in fact, are here today: Nigel Jacob and Chris Osgood. And I just wanted to highlight that, and that's something they deserve credit for, but Mitch also deserves credit for, and Mayor Menino deserves credit for, and Judith Curlin deserves credit for. But on top of us recognizing that city governments are both necessary and in many cases remarkable institutions, we also have to rethink the place of the university, which does not mean a lack of confidence in our basic mission, but it does mean recognizing our extraordinary weaknesses. And I think Mitch really did correctly point out that in fact we have a lot to learn. Part of the central message, I think, of the Rappaport Institute has always been that there's extraordinary value in the city-university connection. And from the university's point of view, it's not because we have so much to teach to the city, although occasionally I hope that we do have something to teach for the city. It is that we have so much to learn from the city. That in fact engagement with Boston, engagement with Cambridge, engagement with the entire region is something that makes us better as scholars, that makes us engage with the real world, that helps us ask the right questions, that teaches us about job creation through the process of understanding how jobs are really created here in Greater Boston. And that is something, in fact, that we have to gain so strongly from reimagining this relationship, from one that starts with a point of humility on the part of the university and a recognition of the enormous strengths of the city. And I think that's part of, I think, Hank's really important comment, which is this only works if it's mutually beneficial, if we both see the gains that come from it. And it is really important that the university understands how much it has through engagement in its community. And I am so grateful to Rob, to Chris, to Liz Cohen, to the city officials for helping make that case here today. And with that, I'd like to, I think we have a couple more minutes. We can open it up to some questions from the,
Can I mention one thing
floor.
first? I forgot
Of course
to
you
mention
can.
it. So I mentioned the pipeline of talent into the city. I forgot to recognize the woman who allows us to do that every single day. Patricia Boyle McKenna is here in the back. And if you want to understand how... I have an idea for a natural experiment. Social scientists love natural experiments, so I have an idea for one that's going to embarrass Patricia. So I think she's the reason that we're able to succeed so well with our fellows. She's going to be out on maternity leave in a few weeks, and so we'll probably be a disaster over the next 12 weeks. We can compare the prior 12 and the next 12 and see how we do, to see what an important task Patricia has. For the folks from other universities, if you want to understand how you link up with the city, you should talk to her after our event.
Wonderful. Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, ma'am. In back, we'll do.
Hi there. I'm Amanda Whitman. I'm the Director of Research for Campus Compact, which is a national nonprofit organization based in Boston that works on civic engagement issues in higher education. And one of the things that you all are talking about in terms of reimagining both the city and the university that you haven't talked on is how we reimagine, how we promote, and how we reward this kind of work being done at the university level. I think that what's awesome is that you guys have all been speaking, but many of you are high-level professionals, you're fully tenured, you have great things behind you, but what about the assistant professor that's being told they need to publish or perish? So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to how you guys are seeing how we go through reimagining, how we promote this through tenure and promotion at the university level.
Yeah, may I mention about that? Just the issue here, we had a little talk about over this, on the same topic over lunch, and that the issue is to what degree the senior faculty, the tenured faculty, create space, create partnerships and shoulder the partnerships that actually create a we where the assistant professors can actually come in and get building grants and whatever, that the full professors and there's a number of us in our sort of consortium at Penn who actually create the funding context and also broker the relationships to make sure that the research that's being conducted is the research that's the high priority research for the collaboration between the city, the school district, and the city and the family courts. So that we broker that relationship for them and we create a space for them so they don't have to then go and forge that really difficult partnership. So that's where if you have those agreements, in our case an integrated data system, you then can basically make sure that you're providing these opportunities to junior folks. And then those junior folks they're not beholden to the senior folks because they can create their own grant structure. But it's leading, just like Mitch was saying, it's leading them to the key people and to the key priorities that will actually speed up their abilities to get grants and to publish.
Terrific. We have time for one more question. You had your hand up, sir.
I'm Elliot Rothman. I'm a planner and an architect. But my question is, the future of medical practice is tied to the data collected through the future of the computerized medical record. My question is whether in education there is a future student record that provides continuity for student outcomes as a future way of collecting data about individual students and maintaining that data longitudinally.
Well, let me take a crack at a piece of that. I'm sure my colleagues will have more to say. I mean, the success of the work of the consortium on Chicago school research is based on having the best data set in the country on student records over time, who their teachers are, how they've progressed, whether they graduate or not, and it's an essential tool. Now, we have a lot of work to do on the actual test data, and what the soft facts as we're learning across the country. But I think that the ability to generate data sets that have the right facts, was also an earlier comment about building these across the country. I think that we're not where medical records are in the same way, but I think the future is very much toward building the right assessments and the right ability to track over time.
Yeah, and you heard our colleague basically talk about just the most large public systems, public school systems are really, with the budget cuts, getting hurt most in research and evaluation. And so they're losing it. And then the question is their capacities to actually, many of our grades are actually are siloed, that the information from kindergarten to first grade to second grade does not even have a consistent assessment where you can follow children longitudinally. We really have to build these capacities, particularly in the early grades. The first time we have the standardized testing is third grade. That's way too late for many of our kids.
Margaret, I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about how you think the fractionalization of suburban towns relates to data collection and this issue. Or indeed, you can speak on anything you want.
Well, it's just an issue of capacity.
Yeah.
That the capacity in many of these areas is very low. The willingness to accept that they have a problem is often very low. I do think that the schools are the one place where through the professionals, not through the politicians, is probably the entryway into the data collection and getting a sense of what the problems are there and beginning to address it.
Right, that's very wise. Well, I've been told that I must stop at 5:07, so, or else there will be terrible punishments meted down on me. So I want to thank our terrific panel. I'm really, really very, very grateful, and thank Radcliffe, and thank the City of Boston, and thank all of you for coming.
When Rob and I conceived of this conference, symposium, and started to put it together with our partners at Rappaport and Radcliffe, we had a number of goals. One was to figure out how much interest there was, and our hope was we'd have maybe 75, 100 people register for the conference. We're well over 400, so I guess there's a fair bit of interest. Second was to find out how broad the interest was in the community as a whole, and if you look at who's come here today, it's the whole swath of the greater Boston communities. Academics, it's government people, it's nonprofit people, it's private citizens, you name it. So we've learned a lot there. Certainly today we've seen a number of models of success for university-city partnerships. If we had run the conference for 3 days, we could have brought in a whole lot more that are in Boston and other places. Our apologies for those of you who have great, successful ones that didn't get to participate today. Only so much time. We've heard a lot today about challenges. Challenges about trust, challenges about continuity and consistency, and challenges about funding. We hope there's some people here who have some capacity to help solve the latter problem. We certainly have heard a lot of wisdom about what it takes to succeed, particularly from this last panel. I'm particularly struck across all the panels how the notion of data, integrated data systems, keeps coming up over and over again, and the argument that that's got to be a central core to making these partnerships work. If that's right, I think we've got a lot of work to do here in Boston. Now, the goal of this conference was not just to encourage a whole lot more city, university, college partnerships. We've got a lot of those. For Boston, you know, one of its very big challenges is, can the whole here be more than the sum of the parts? I came to Harvard in '92. I'd been at Northwestern, and my colleagues here always ask me, what's it like? And I always say, both Boston and Harvard are a fantastic place to do your own thing. Very true. And so I think one of the questions going forward is, how can this effort be organized, managed, so it isn't just a whole bunch of one-off projects, but there's real synergy and the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So let me just say a little bit about our thinking. For sure, in the next few weeks, we're going to be meeting and knocking heads from all the things we've learned from this conference to figure out sort of what best ways forward. But there are 5 things at least that are on the table. Obviously, this effort's going to need some type of advisory council. It needs to be broad, diverse, and inclusive. Not sure, you know, sort of what that actually means in terms of when you implement it. But, you know, it would be really a shame to take all the energy in this room and sort of wish you a great time, and we'll see you next year or the year after at the next one of these conferences. There's a lot of work to do and awfully a lot of interest. This last year, building on the Rappaport's internship program, Rappaport and Radcliffe started providing summer internships to doctoral students, PhD students. And that's turned out to be just an amazing success. Our graduate students come back totally astounded by what the real world looks like outside the Ivy Tower. And I keep hearing from the people in the government agencies, boy, is it great to hear what new academic thinking is, get an academic perspective. So we're going to continue on in that and hopefully expand that program. Third effort we want to do is to create some small research policy working groups. This whole effort started with the premise that what we wanted was to have the very best people at the table thinking about Boston, Greater Boston's problems. And it didn't matter whether those people were at Harvard, they were someplace else. And, you know, obviously, for these kinds of things to be successful, we've got to have people from government and people from community. Fourth, in terms of data, we have been working, the Center for Geographical Analysis has something called World Map, appropriate for a place like Harvard. We don't have small ambitions. But within that is something called Boston Map, and that is a geographic information system that provides extensive data on the greater Boston area. There's going to be a demonstration of that right after this. And then finally, and I certainly think the technology session this morning provided a lot of inspiration, we do want to try to create some kind of online forum structure. We've got most of your email addresses. If you have not given us your email address, please do, or send us your email address. Obviously, the internet, the web, creates some real potential to try to figure out how to organize all this interest and energy, and we certainly want to undertake that challenge. So thank you all very much for coming, and Rob's going to have the last word.
I've learned a tremendous amount today, and I just want to take a minute here before closing to thank everybody for coming. It's been a long day, but I think you've learned a lot. I certainly have. And I want to go back to my remarks this morning in the sense that this really was sort of an experiment, and we're really glad to see the results already in terms of the kind of thinking. Because as I noted this morning, You know, one of our theses going into this was that, at least from the academic perspective, that testing fundamental ideas and fundamental knowledge, basic knowledge, requires knowledge of practice and how things happen, right? And that's actually kind of a radical thesis. And in different ways, in each panel, I think you heard that and you saw examples of how new knowledge comes about through that kind of interaction. And you know, I spent a lot of years studying crime, for example, and I have to tell you, I have many colleagues that will go unnamed who've never walked the streets of a dangerous neighborhood, talked to a police officer, ridden a police officer's car. It makes a difference. But secondly, practitioners need independent analyses, right? So fresh eyes, new insights. And both of these theses are intertwined. Both parties need and learn from one another. It's not really a hierarchical relationship. But to push that further requires, and again, we've heard it in each different panel in different ways, a new kind of infrastructure. And that infrastructure can take many forms, right? There's infrastructure that has to do with data. We've heard about that, whether it be integrated data systems. It has to do with process. We've heard about the nature of the interactions among the different actors. But I think it also takes, there's a bit of a change in culture that's necessary. And I was very interested in Mitch's remarks, the last comments in the last panel, because I heard him say that, really is about a bit of change of culture, certainly in the academic culture, and about what kinds of things that we reward in the academy. So there are a lot of big issues here on the table. And we didn't resolve them all today, and that was the point of Chris announcing that this was the first attempt, at least on our part, to systematize what's going on, what are some examples. We have some ideas for where to go forward, but I guess the last thing I would say is that another part of our idea is that Boston can be a leader. There's a lot of good stuff already going on, but it can be a leader in innovating the next level, and that's what we hope to do. So with that, I just want to invite you to retire with us downstairs, just next door, maybe 10 yards or so from the entrance onto the Agassiz house, where a very nice reception awaits us, and yet more intellectual nourishment, because what we've done is to put together displays, posters, something like, I think, 7 poster sessions on very interesting topics, from the impact of real-time data on Boston's commuter rail riders, to building financial capacity among Boston's youth, to results on performance management, to helping Boston citizens utilize neighborhood-level census data, and many others. There'll be 4 new web platform demonstrations, and there'll be wine and cheese, and the provost from Harvard will say a few words about the whole initiative and steps going forward. So thank you for coming. It's been a terrific day.